Today in the shop, we are taking a look at our engine mounts in our 99 Acura and ideally finding a smoking gun of a worn or broken engine mount causing our idle vibration. And before we get started, please make sure to take a moment to support the channel by dropping a like, hitting subscribe, and letting me know down in the comments what you're working on today. And with that, sit back and relax, and I hope you enjoy the video. Here we're going to start with setting up our workspace and getting some lighting going. And we're going to start out with a detailed visual inspection of the engine bay itself and developing kind of a game plan for how we're going to test these mounts and gain access to them. You see a larger pry bar there, kind of getting a game plan together on how to attack this. And we're going to start with some of the low-hanging fruit, kind of clearing some of the larger pieces away, specifically with the intake. So we have a piece of ductwork here, and then we're going to start to remove the filter box and the snorkel going to the throttle body here. You can hear how angry some of these fasteners are with just how old they are, 25 plus years old, and you can kind of hear how unwilling they are to come out with all the creaking and cracking they're making. Filter's definitely got some dirt and debris on the bottom side. Now with that larger piece of the intake out of the way, I'm now taking a look at the rear side of the engine here, checking out just the mount itself, looking underneath the distributor. I think at this point I'm starting to see a little bit of oil leak or seepage from the distributor seal to the cam itself. So just kind of evaluating what's going on there, trying to get a better look, some better leverage to see where that's originating from and to what severity it currently is. In here we're checking out the rear engine mount buried underneath the intake manifold. Typically, not just specific to Hondas or Acuras, but typically one of the more buried or more difficult engine mounts to access. So kind of evaluating all of them. The front engine mount and the driver's side are somewhat recent replacements, so I'm not too worried about them. I'm looking more at this trans mount behind the battery and the rear engine mount. So hopefully the game plan here is we can remove the trans mount and kind of see if that is worn and weak, and ideally replace that without having to do too much overlapping work removing the rear mount to see if we can get away with just replacing this one as the problem child before we have to spend more time and more effort removing the rear. And this piece is kind of unique. It looks like it has a vacuum line going into the base of it, like a diaphragm. So moving that out of the way just to gain better access to the mount itself. And here we're breaking out just a telescoping mirror to get different angles on the mounts themselves. Again, to see if we see any obvious breaks in the mount itself. Again, just continuing that visual inspection as we expose more angles to view these mounts by removing different pieces. And here we're using our good friend leverage with a pry bar, physically manipulating and moving these mounts around just to see how much tension and strength they kind of have to them as an indicator of overall condition. It's not the most scientific of tests, but it definitely gives you an idea if there's one that is glaringly weaker or less resistant to the leverage that we're putting on it than the others. And now that we've kind of messed around with the easier to access front three mounts, we're now going to be taking a look to see if we can also gain access to the rear mount with that pry bar. So we're disconnecting a couple electrical connectors around the throttle body just to make sure that we don't have anything silly happen. You know, as we're moving the pry bar around, we don't want to accidentally be rubbing up or touching or breaking anything. So it's kind of like threading a needle into somewhat of a available space to insert the pry bar, but definitely possible, at least with this engine, to get it back there. Here we're kind of taking a detour from the mounts and breaking out some brake clean to clean up some of the oil residue that we're seeing under the distributor itself, just to kind of give it a fresh clean and then be able to monitor, you know, where it's originating from a little bit closer without having a larger mess trying to figure out where it's coming from. Here we're dealing with more rusted fasteners on these J-bolts for this battery hold down, so we are applying a little bit of strength and leverage to these, but not being too caveman to snap them. And out she comes. Next up, we're working on physically disconnecting the battery and removing it. So here, these are some aftermarket terminals that we have on the vehicle that the positive will be an Allen or a Torx bolt, essentially. And then the negative will just be, I think, a 17 mil nut. So we're kind of working through some corrosion here, but again, basically freeing the battery up so we gain even more space to work. Next, we're going to wheel over our jack and cut a couple pieces of scrap wood so that we can brace the transmission and remove the mount. Here we're going to begin unbolting the mount from the trans itself, and it looks like our stud actually came out with our nut here. Totally fine. We're actually going to need to remove the studs in order to get the mount out anyway, so we're just working through that. I believe these were also 17, possibly 19. I got to hammer one of them on just with all the corrosion. So this is a situation where all those metrics and dyno tests on the torque test channel will come into play. That CP 3.0 couldn't do it, but this 5.0 will be able to. And then here's pretty typical. We're removing the last bolt, kind of the through bolt here, and it's pretty stuck. So we just have to raise the trans a little bit to give it a little bit of a clear shot to just physically slide out. So very common when you're removing engine mounts that the weight will shift and you have to make small adjustments, millimeters if anything, to get certain fasteners to cooperate. Here you'll see that we're stuck on one of the last studs that are sticking out of the transmission, so instead of trying to remove anything else unnecessarily, we're just going to use the 2-nut method to pull this stud out and then free up our engine mount. For anyone unfamiliar with the quote-unquote 2-nut method, all we're doing here is we're taking 2 of the same nuts and flipping one upside down and threading it onto the stud, and then taking another one and threading it on normally, and basically sandwiching them against each other so that we can then turn the upside down bottom nut and ideally break the stud loose. Okay, and there we are. So it took a little bit more to actually sandwich the nuts together and get them to stay. But we were successful, and now we can go ahead and get our mount out and visually inspect it from there. Okay, now that we've got the mount nice and free, we're going to take some leverage here along a screwdriver, and we'll use the through bolt as well. And we're just trying to manipulate the mount in our hands and kind of brace it, as you see here in the battery tray. And what I'm seeing, it might not show up super well on camera, but a lot of dry cracks throughout the mount itself. You know, again, being 25 plus years old. This may not be the smoking gun, but it may be a worn out mount that we need to replace regardless. And then here what I want to do is hand thread the studs back into the trans itself, at least to a certain depth, to make sure that the threads are somewhat clean, and I can thread this stud in by hand. Okay, and now the only thing left to do is hop on Rock Auto and order a new mount. Be here in a few days, so that's going to be our next step. Stay tuned for part 2. Again, make sure to take a moment to support the channel by leaving a like, a comment, and subscribing. And I will see you in the next part. Thank you for watching.